Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and welcome to another mod with me. Today we're going to be modifying the Halloween Oracle. And I thought this was a perfect deck to modify this time of year because it's a deck that I plan on using quite a bit this month. I think the artwork is absolutely gorgeous in this deck, and it definitely fits for this time of year. Although, like I said in my other video, I think that this is a deck that I will use year-round because the images are really beautiful, and I think they will work with a lot of different decks that I have. But they are quite large, and they do have this extra black border around them. So I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and trim it down to just make it a little bit smaller, make it a little bit easier for me to handle. It is quite glossy, which means it's a little bit sticky. I did consider rebacking it because this is what the backs look like, and mine are actually quite scuffed up. But this really glossy cardstock is sometimes a little bit hard to adhere contact paper to, and honestly I just have so many other projects that I want to get to that I'm not going to take the time to actually do that right now. But at some point I might go back and do that because you can add contact paper to a deck anytime. So you don't have to necessarily do it while you're trimming it. Sometimes that can make it easier, but it's always an option to go back in and add it after the fact. So for today, we're going to just go ahead and trim this deck down, make it a little bit smaller, a little bit easier to handle, and I am going to go ahead and blacken the edges just to give it that nice finished look once I get it trimmed. So let's switch on over to my craft desk and get started. All right, I've got my trusty trimmer, I've got my deck, which I need to take out of the box, and I've got my washi for doing my measurements. Because as I've mentioned in a lot of my recent deck mods, I am using measurements pretty much every time I trim a deck now because it makes for a much cleaner, more uniform trim. And it does take a little bit extra work, but you know, it's totally worth it in the end, I think. So for this particular deck, this card is bent at the bottom. The backs really don't have any sort of they do have a pattern, but there's no lines or anything to act as a guide on the back. So for this particular deck, I'm going to just trim using the front as the guide. Now I could trim, we have a couple different trim options for this deck. I could trim here just to the outside of this colored line because each of these cards does have a colored border inside, a thin colored border inside the outer border. Now I could definitely trim just to the outside of that and leave that so that every card does have a micro border. But sometimes that can be a bit hard to do. It can be hard to get them straight. It can be hard to make sure that you, you know, it's a thin border. So if you overcut on one, you've now messed it up and it's going to look weird in comparison to all the rest. So I'm actually going to go just inside that colored border, get these down completely borderless. One of the things I love about this deck is that the titles and key phrases are actually layered down in the bottom of the artwork, and they all are pretty easy to read. There's like a nice little dark shadow behind them all so that it kind of blends the imagery down into the shadow so you can read the text really well. I think this is just a really well done deck in terms of the design. So for that, you know, I absolutely love that because I can trim this down, make it completely borderless, and you know, it's going to look fabulous, and I'm still going to have my titles and keywords on it because this I do tend to use in regards to the keywords because it has kind of a very specific theme and system, although I think you could use it anytime. But so the first thing that we're going to do is, like always nowadays, and I really need to do an update on my trimming tutorial, but nowadays pretty much what I always do is use measurements. So I'm going to take my first card here, and I am going to cut one side at a time as I usually do, and I'm going to move it just inside that thin colored border. And I'm going to see, so at 3.5, that's not going to get me quite to that would get me right to the outside of the colored border. But I don't really want to keep the border because if my corner rounder is not the exact same size, and if I cut just a little too far one way or the other, I could run the risk of messing that line up. So what I'm going to do is just go like a centimeter or so in. And I do like to get it as close to one of these little marks as I possibly can, because that just makes it easier for me. Rather than going like halfway in between two marks can be a little bit harder to line up. This way I know that my edges are all going to sit right at that little tick mark right there. And I'm just going to go ahead and cut my first side. So it's a fairly easy cardstock to cut, even though it is a little bit thicker. It's not super thin cardstock. I would say it's a nice cardstock actually. So you can see here what I cut off. I cut that micro border and the outer black border to this deck. So I'm just going to basically repeat that process for all of the sides on the whole deck. Okay, so I've got all of the right side of the deck cut off. So you can see no borders on the right side at all anymore. And it came out pretty good, pretty straight for the most part. So what I'm basically going to do now is flip the deck around, because I always like to have the deck kind of going or pointing toward the direction I'm going, so that I just don't accidentally cut the wrong side using the wrong measurement. So I always keep the deck just whatever side I'm cutting is facing my cutter. So that way I'm always making sure that I'm making the right cuts at the right measurements for the right side. So now I'm just going to pop this on here. And again, I'm going to try to find the closest mark that's just to the outside of that line there. And it looks like it's going to be that one right there. So basically just one mark over from where I was. So I'm going to use that and butt up against my tape and make my cut. Now I have got the other side taken off. So I'm just going to go ahead and work my way through this side of the deck. So there's the next side done, and look how great they're looking already. Oh, I just love a borderless deck. I think it just really opens up the artwork. There are very few decks that I really actually like the borders on. So I tend to take them off, and I tend to take them off because it makes my deck smaller, and I like smaller decks, which was definitely a bonus for this one. And also because this, my ancestor card, the bottom of it where the black border is, it was completely bent. So that's okay. I'm going to trim that off. So now we're going to go ahead and let's clip off the bottom of all of the images. So I'm going to just repeat my process. And this is where it starts to get a little bit more difficult as far as doing your measurements, and why the washi tape comes in handy. Although I could probably take a little extra off the top of these. I was just looking through to see if I would cut anything really important off. I could cut off part of the gargoyle's head. So let's see this one. So here we go. We're gonna play a little comparison game. So this one is higher up than this one. And this one is higher up than this one. So yeah, basically what I'm doing is this is so far the tallest image that I found. So I'm using this as my baseline. If I came down just a little bit below that line, a little bit closer to that moon, using that as kind of a little guide, I'm seeing what would be cut off, you know, relatively. I'm just guesstimating right now what would be cut off if I did that. I'm not going to cut into the cat's eyes, although it will get close. So when you're doing a deck, a mod like this, you know, you can take these opportunities to kind of manipulate the deck a little bit. I'm not sure that's really the best word for it, but you can futz with it a little bit to get it more along the lines of the size that you would like. So rather than going just to the other side of that line there, I can come a little bit closer to this moon, and that's going to make the cards just a little bit smaller. Now, granted, it's not going to make a huge difference, but you know, for me, every little bit counts. So here's where I would be cutting, right here. So I'd be right on this line. So I'm going to go down to right above that moon. I think that's good. And because I don't have any marks over here, my washi tape comes in really handy and becomes a really important part of the process. So I want to line that up with my washi, make sure everything is pressed up against this grade here, and that I'm lined up correctly on this side. Because the whole point of this, the whole point of using measurements is to get everything as close to exact as you can so that you get a nice clean cut throughout your entire deck. And so see, that got that pretty close to the top, but did not cut into the moon. So I'll just work my way through these cards. Sometimes with the washi, you have to be careful. If I had a darker washi, that would probably be helpful. It's kind of hard for me to see it. Here, let's swap it for a darker one because sometimes that lighter one is hard for me to see. Not that it really matters. I just grab whatever washi. That one tends to be the one I grab. I'm just going to lay it over the top of it because I don't want to pick it up and move it. And now that I've got that on there, I can see that my washi is not on there straight. So we want to check where was I lining it up. So I am going to end up moving it. You do have to watch, and I should have mentioned this in many other videos. When you pull this washi up and down up off these boards that, or these cutters that have this plastic overlay over the board, sometimes it peels it up a little bit, so you got to be a little bit careful. So is that about right? Sometimes this is just a, you know, it's just a trial and error. And what's happening is every time I'm picking up the washi, the plastic overlay on my board here is being peeled up with my washi. So if I do that there, perfect. So that was where it was at. So hopefully that will be a little bit easier for me to see. I'm just gonna back it up to the washi there. And finish my trimming. Isn't this deck gorgeous? I just think this deck is so pretty. I don't know why it's taking me so long to get it. It's not even expensive or anything. You know how it is, you like buy all these super expensive indie decks, and then you have like these, I don't want to say cheap because these are not cheap decks, but it's cheap in terms of you know, production or anything like that. But then you have these very affordable decks, let's say that. These very affordable decks that for some reason just take forever for you to get around to purchasing, even though you know that it'll probably be a deck you use a lot. I could see myself, like I think I've said many times now, I could see myself using this deck for all kinds of readings all throughout the year. So I don't think that it's necessarily going to be just a you know, autumn deck for me. I think I might use it throughout the year. We shall see. So anyway, I'm going to quit babbling and finish up trimming the tops off these cards. Okay, so we got our tops all cut off. It's looking really good. I am loving it. So I don't know if you can tell here, but So using these measurements, I'm getting a really pretty dang straight cut. Like all my cards are pretty close to like, you know, machine cut. It's of course never going to be as clean and as uniform as a machine cut, but I'm getting it pretty dang close, if I do say so myself. The more you do this, I think the better you get at it, like anything else. But so now we're down to our last side, and this is going to get us closer into actual marks. So even if, you know, say I was cutting the tops off and I was, you know, a little bit further one way or the other on one of these cards, if I had it pushed too far up this way, or if I had it too far that way, using this next measurements, I'll be able to compensate for that and still make sure that they're all exactly the same size. And that's one of the really great things about using the measurements, is that it allows you to, because you're doing all the sides at one time, if you accidentally overcut one way or the other, you can compensate on the opposite side. Now, eventually there gets to a point where you can't, right? But when I cut the right side off, I could use my left side cuts to kind of compensate for any inconsistencies I may have had on the right side, and the same with the top here. So now I'm just going to measure this out. I am just going to go probably just to the other side of that colored line, that thin border, because I don't want to get my bottom too close to the words. So my sticky stuff is peeling up, so I'm basically going to find what's my closest mark, and it is right there. And again, we have, you know, tape's not 100% straight, so I'm going to back it off a little bit to get it as straight as I can, making sure again everything is pressed up where it needs to be. And make my cut, because now this is my final cut, so the cut that I make now will be, I won't be able to make any more adjustments unless I decide to go back and, you know, retrim and make them all smaller, which is never something I really want to do. I try to trim them the right way the first time, every time. So there you can see I got down to the card, or down the bottom, got trimmed off of that little bit of the line. Now you can see here, hopefully you can see here, that I've got more black on the inside of this line than this line. Now that means that either I didn't cut straight. Totally possible. Sometimes, particularly with these glossy cards, these slippery cards, sometimes they can shift around a little bit on your board when you're putting the pressure on of the blade coming through it. And this guide can sometimes shift a card around, and these are minute shifts, but it does happen. And when these cards shift just slightly one way or the other, sometimes that can result in a cut like this, where you're not quite getting it straight. It probably is straight. I mean, I don't even know, like if I line it up there, it doesn't look like I've got more on one side than the other. So most likely the printing is not quite straight. And I always just I just blame the printer. Like it's not my fault. I didn't cut crooked. The printing is crooked. And a lot of times with the borders, and I think I've mentioned this in other videos, when you have those borders like that, they don't have to be precise with the printing because it's not full bleed, full color. So it's not borderless. So you can get that their printing can be just the slightest, the tiniest little bit off. And we don't notice because we've got that border around there. But when you start cutting and you're cutting off borders, then you do notice because you've got, you can see it. You can see it in your cuts like I've got with this one. So I'm going to just basically line it up again, make sure that I do have it where I wanted it, and I'm going to give it a little cut, making sure that I'm putting lots of pressure. And it cut like a hair. So I was pretty dang close. Because this is square, right? I mean, we hope that it's square. If it's not, then all my cards are wonky, but anyway, so yeah, that can happen. Let's just go ahead and do another one and see how it comes out. So again, we're getting the same thing where we're getting more black on this side than we are on this side. So I am thinking that the printing is just slightly off. I mean, I can measure this and pull my blade up and down and it's not catching anywhere. So that means that this is in here pretty straight because I'm flush against here and I'm flush against this. And if I pull these two cards together, they are flush. So, you know, it's okay. It's not like a big deal. Your card, when you're cutting it, is coming out straight. But when you see that, when you cut a card and you see this border come off and you look at it and go, there's a bunch more black over here than there is over here. Sometimes that can kind of freak you out because you think, I didn't cut straight. You know, just check it again, see if you did. Most likely you probably did, especially if you're using a cutter like this. Now, if you're cutting by hand with scissors, that is a totally different story, and I do not do that. I've never cut a deck with scissors because I can't cut a straight line to save my life. If you've watched some of my journaling videos, you've probably seen that I'm terrible with a pair of scissors. So I don't even try. I have my guillotine trimmer here, which I love. And you know, it's got my little measurements on it that I use because I'm a little OCD when it comes to stuff like this. So, and at first, when I first started modding decks, I'm totally rambling today, you guys. I hope you don't mind. When I first started modding decks, I was like, oh, I don't care if they're, you know, if they're not 100%. I don't care if they come out like, if you look at my Llewellyn, which I've showed in a million videos, and I won't drag it out and put you through that again, but my Llewellyn is not even. You can definitely tell where some cards are shorter than others, some cards are narrower than others, and you know, you can totally tell. Now, I love that deck regardless, and part of what I love about that deck is its imperfection. It was one of the first, not the first, but one of the first decks I ever trimmed, and it, you know, has a special place in my heart now, of course, but at first, when I first started modifying decks, I was like, oh, it's fine. You know, it doesn't need to be straight. I'm totally cool with it being kind of wonky. Like, that's my word, right? My bags are wonky. My decks are wonky. Everything's wonky. But when I did do the measurements, and I think it was on the Guardian Angel Tarot because I wanted to trim off the gilding, but I didn't want to cut off any more than I needed to. So I used the measurements. When I saw how that deck came out and how much smoother the trim was, how much more uniform the decks were when they were stacked together, or the cards were when they were stacked together, that just kind of sold me on doing it this way. And so I have been doing it this way ever since. And I do highly recommend it because even though I said I didn't care, I apparently I do, and I like them like this. I like them when they are nice and uniform. I think they do shuffle a little bit better. Could be just me, could be wishful thinking, but I feel like the more uniform cut you get on your cards, the better the deck actually shuffles, because a lot of times trimmed decks don't shuffle as well. So anyway, that's my little ramble about that. So I'm going to stop rambling once again and finish trimming this deck. All right, so we've got them all trimmed down to just the artwork, taking those borders off, and oh, look how beautiful they are. This is one of those decks that I think just should have been borderless. It was just meant to be borderless. Look how gorgeous. And again, I made them just a tiny bit smaller because I took a little bit extra off the top, and I got a pretty uniform cut on both sides, and the backs really don't, you know, really don't look a whole lot different. So the next thing that we're going to do is go ahead and round the corners. I think that the medium one is going to be just fine. because really all we're looking to do with the corner rounder is just take those sharp edges off, and it just makes for a nicer working deck. Didn't quite get that one. I do have my little paper towel swatch just to rub off any excess that might bleed over onto it. In general, Crayola dries pretty fast, but usually you can wipe off any excess as long as you do it pretty much right after you edge. And you always want to keep your marker pointed back with the back of the card to you. That will prevent some of the bleed over from the front, because if there's going to be bleed, if your marker is tipped more towards your back, that's where it's going to bleed to. I do have a couple of tutorials on working with edging decks and working with markers in particular. So if you want to check those out for more information on that. So I'm just going to run it around here just to make sure I am not getting any on the front of the card. The backs are black, so if it wrapped around onto the back, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. But now we just set them aside and we just work our way through the deck. So I've got about roughly half of the deck edged with the black Crayola. I thought we'd just gather them all up and see it in comparison to the section of the deck that I haven't edged yet. I'm just going to carefully stack them up here. Crayola does dry pretty quick, but you know, it does take a few minutes. I generally like to give Crayola about 10 to 15 minutes before I really start trying to handle things too much. And I generally give it, you know, an hour or two before I start really trying to use it and mess with it too much, because I just really want it to be able to set really well. So here we have the side that I have edged, or the half that I've edged, and you can see it just creates that nice finished look to it. And here we have the raw edges. So you can see, well, I did a little bit more than half, but so you can see kind of a big difference. I think it just really gives it that polished look, where we have, you know, the unfinished edges here, which do just look unfinished. And then we have the nice black edges here. So I'm going to set these ones aside and let them dry. And I'm going to go ahead and finish up edging the rest of the deck, and then we will come back for a final look at the modification to the Halloween Oracle. So I've completed my modification of the Halloween Oracle, and I have made it a beautiful borderless deck. I have edged it in black just to finish it off nicely. I did leave the backs. I may at some point cover those in contact paper, but for now I'm just going to leave it. But I think they look absolutely beautiful borderless. How gorgeous are those? I love it finished off with the black edges. I just think that looks so nice. So let's go ahead and just lay a couple of the cards out just so we can see how they look. So there you can see them all laid out together. How beautiful do they look? They definitely tell us a nice story. It's a deck that I'm really looking forward to working with, not only just this season, but throughout the rest of the year probably, and hopefully beyond that as well. So thank you for joining me for this mod with me of the Halloween Oracle. I hope that you enjoyed this video and will join me again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.